The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of iron and despair. It coated in May's tongue, gritted between her teeth, and clung to the tear-dampened lashes of her eyes. Each ragged breath was a new torment, a fresh reminder of the screams she had left behind. They echoed not in the canyon air, but in the hollow spaces of her skull, a percussive rhythm of leather on flesh, of guttural laughter, of her mother's sharp, bird-like cries of pain. The town was a creature of sharp angles and long shadows in the merciless afternoon sun. Splintered boardwalks, false-fronted buildings leaning into one another like tired drunks, and the ever-present, grinding noise from the silver mine that owned them all. And May ran, her thin slippers slapping against the hard-packed earth, her heart a wild bird battering itself against the cage of her ribs. She was a small, frantic specter against the vast, indifferent landscape of ochre rock and pale sky. Her mind fixated on a single point of supposed sanctuary. The squat stone building at the end of the main thoroughfare, the one with the tarnished brass plate that read Mayor, he was a ghost of a man, this Mayor Thorne. A figure seen only in passing, tall and severe, with a face carved from the same unforgiving granite as the surrounding mountains. He was law here or what passed for it. A law that had, until this moment, remained entirely separate from the small, circumscribed world she and her mother inhabited at the edge of town. A world of laundry steam, medicinal herbs, and the careful, quiet navigation of hatred. Now, that world was being torn apart by men in bowler hats, men with cudgels and the cold, dead eyes of corporate authority. The Pinkertons. They had come to their small shack, accusing her mother of theft, of sabotage, of simply being. The accusation was incidental. The reason was the slant of her eyes, the language of her ancestors whispered over a cooking fire. And May had seen the first blow land, a sickening thud that had stolen the air from her own lungs. Her mother had pushed her, a fierce, desperate shove towards the door. Go, her eyes had screamed. Live. And May stumbled up the two worn steps to the mayor's office and threw her weight against the heavy oak door. It gave way with a groan, and she spilled into the cool, dim interior. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and something metallic, like oiled steel. Behind a massive desk cluttered with maps and geological surveys sat the man himself. Mayor Thorne did not look up immediately. He was cleaning a part from a surveyor's transit with a small, oiled cloth, his movements precise and unhurried. He was older than she'd thought, the lines around his eyes and mouth etched deep, his dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. He wore no badge, no gun belt, just a simple work shirt and vest. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a flat, penetrating gray that seemed to absorb all the light in the room and give nothing back. They took in her disheveled state, the frantic heave of her chest, the wildness in her dark eyes, the bloody scrape on her cheek where a stray rock had cut her as she fell. She could not form the words. They were lodged in her throat, a knot of terror and fury. Her hands clenched into small, trembling fists at her sides. He waited, his stillness a stark contrast to her panic. It was a terrifyingly calm stillness, as if he had seen 1,000 desperate people burst into his office and had learned that haste solved nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by her own gasping breaths and the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Finally, a single sob broke from her, a sound of such profound anguish that it seemed to physically pain him. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Speak," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It was not unkind, but it was not gentle. It was a command. The command broke the dam. Words, hot and sharp, tumbled from her lips, stumbling over one another in their urgency. "They are beating her," she rasped, the dust in her throat turning the words to sandpaper. "The company men, the Pinkertons, at our home. They are beating my mother." She took another ragged breath, her gaze locking with his, trying to pour all of her horror, all of her violation, into that single look. She saw no pity there, only a deep, unsettling focus. He was not feeling her pain. He was dissecting it, analyzing its source and its implications. This coldness, This lack of immediate sympathy fueled her desperation into a white-hot point of rage. Justice felt too small a word, too civilized for the brutality she had witnessed. She wanted retribution. She wanted annihilation. She took a step closer to the desk, her small frame rigid with a strength born of pure despair. Her voice dropped, losing its frantic edge and hardening into something cold and absolute. She is Chinese. That is her crime. For this, they act like animals. You are the mayor. You are the law here. She paused, the world narrowing to the space between them, to the plea that was tearing its way out of her soul. I want you to unalive them, she whispered, the words tasting like poison and prayer. Please, make them stop. End them. Thorn did not flinch. His expression remained unchanged, his gray eyes fixed on hers. He held her gaze for a long moment, an eternity in which May felt she was being weighed and measured, her soul laid bare on the polished surface of his desk. He was looking past her desperation to the core of her, to the iron will that had propelled her here. He slowly placed the piece of the transit and the oily cloth on the desk, his movements deliberate. Then he rose to his full, considerable height, his shadow swallowing her whole. He reached for a heavy coat hanging on a peg by the door, and for the first time, she saw the worn leather of a gun belt looped over it. He did not speak. He did not offer a word of comfort or a promise of action. He simply walked past her, opened the door, and stepped out into the brutal, unforgiving sun, leaving her to follow in the wake of his silence. And in that silence, more terrifying and more promising than any shouted vow, lay the first, fragile seed of a terrible hope. And May followed, her bare feet padding on the dusty boardwalk, her world hanging suspended on the actions of this stoic, unreadable man. The screams in her head quieted, replaced by the thud of his boots on the wood. A new rhythm, a new, uncertain drumbeat marching towards a reckoning. The walk to the edge of town was a torment of slowness. Mayor Thorne moved with a long, ground-eating stride that forced May into a near trot to keep pace. He did not look back to see if she was following. He simply presumed it. The townsfolk they passed melted away, their hostile stares and muttered slurs dying on their lips as they registered the man she walked behind. His presence seemed to alter the very air, bending the town's casual cruelty into a grudging, fearful respect. He was not one of them, she realized. He was their keeper. And May's focus remained fixed on his broad back, a shield between her and the world. With every step, the sounds from her home grew louder, clearer. The sickening, wet thud of fists, the splintering of wood, the cruel laughter of men enjoying their power. The hope that had flickered in his office began to dim, consumed by a rising tide of dread. He was just one man. What could one man do against the company? They reached the small, dusty plot where her shack leaned against a rocky outcrop. 2 Pinkerton agents were on the porch, their coats discarded in the heat. A third was methodically kicking apart the small vegetable garden her mother tended with such care. Inside, through the shattered doorframe, she could see another man holding her mother by the hair while a fifth, a large man with a florid face and a handlebar mustache, was speaking to her in a low, menacing tone. Her mother, Su Lin, was slumped against him, her face bruised and swollen, a trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth, yet her eyes, when they briefly met in May's, still held a spark of defiance. That spark was everything. Thorne stopped at the edge of the property line, a place marked by a row of carefully placed stones. He did not shout or draw his weapon. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. Took a moment for the agents to notice him. The man in the garden was the first, his boot halting mid-stomp. He grunted, nudging his companion on the porch. One by one, they turned, their amusement curdling into wary irritation. "This is company business, Mayor," the man on the porch said, his hand moving instinctively towards the pistol on his hip. "Best you move along." Thorne's gaze swept over the scene, cataloging every detail. The broken door, the ruined garden, the woman held captive, the fear and rage in May's eyes beside him. His expression remained a mask of stone. "This is my town, Mr. Finney," he replied, his voice calm but carrying with an authority that cut through the afternoon heat. "And this," he gestured slightly towards Su Lin, "is a resident of my town." The large man inside, clearly the leader, pushed Su Lin away. She stumbled and fell to the floor in a heap. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. "She's a thief and a saboteur, and you have no jurisdiction over company matters, Thorne. You know the arrangement." "I know the law," Thorne stated, his voice flat and absolute. "Assault is assault, and you are on the wrong side of it." He took a single, deliberate step forward, crossing the line of stones. It was a declaration. This ground was now his. And May watched, her breath caught in her chest. This was not the violent retribution she had begged for. It was something slower, colder, and far more dangerous. It was a battle of wills, fought in the space between words. The Pinkertons exchanged uncertain glances. They were men accustomed to brute force, to the simple math of cudgels and fear. They did not know how to fight this quiet, unyielding man who met their aggression not with fire, but with ice. "You're making a mistake," the leader Jarrett warned. "The only mistake being made is you thinking I'll let you make another one," Thorne said, his gray eyes locking onto Jarrett's. "Leave. Now." For a long, tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The distant clang of the mine, the buzz of flies, the ragged breathing of May beside him. It all faded into a roaring silence. Jarrett's face flushed with anger, his hand twitching. And May saw the subtle shift in Thorne's stance, the way his hand rested near the worn grip of his own revolver. He was ready, she knew, but he would not be the one to start it. Finally, with a snarled curse, Jarrett gave a sharp jerk of his head. "Fine. We're done here. For now." He spat on the ground near Su Lin's ruined vegetables. "Watch your back, Mayor. The company has a long memory." The agents collected their coats, swaggering with a bravado that felt hollow. They did not look at May or her mother as they left, their focus entirely on the man who had faced them down. As their footsteps receded down the path, Thorne remained motionless, watching until they were gone. Only then did he seem to relax, the tension leaving his shoulders. He turned, his gaze falling on May, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not pity, but a kind of weary acknowledgement of the world's ugliness. He then looked past her, towards the shack, where Su Lin was slowly, painfully, pushing herself up from the floor. Without another word, he walked to their well, took the bucket, and began to draw fresh, cool water. The harsh, violent noise of the confrontation was replaced by the simple, steady creak of the rope and pulley, a sound of profound and unexpected peace. And May ran inside to her mother, her heart a confusing mix of terror, relief, and a strange, burgeoning awe for the silent man who was now tending to their most basic needs. In the days that followed, silence became the primary language between them. Mayor Thorne did not speak of the incident, nor did he offer platitudes or promises of future safety. His presence was his word. Each morning, just after dawn, a small bundle would be on their doorstep. A loaf of bread, a few potatoes, once a small tin of salve for Su Lin's cuts. He never waited for thanks. And May would sometimes catch a glimpse of his tall figure receding down the path as she opened the door, a fleeting shadow against the rising sun. He moved through their lives with the quiet persistence of a season changing, an undeniable force that asked for nothing in return. He came by one afternoon and, with a hammer and a handful of nails he produced from his coat, repaired their broken door, his movements economical and efficient. He worked without speaking, while Su Lin sat in a chair, watching him with wary, intelligent eyes, and May swept the shards of a broken pot from the floor. And May found herself studying him, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic facade. He was a creature of habit and precision. The way he tested the new hinges on the door, the methodical manner in which he stacked a small pile of firewood he'd brought near their hearth. It all spoke of a man who found order in action, not in speech. She began to see the town through his eyes. She noticed how the saloon quieted when he passed, how the merchants nodded with a deference that was more than simple respect. It was a form of acknowledgement, a recognition of his solitary authority. He was an island in a sea of greed and prejudice, and for reasons she could not comprehend, he had extended the shores of his island to include her and her mother. Trust was not a sudden revelation. It was a slow, geological process, built in layers of observed consistency. It was in the way he met her gaze directly, without the contempt or dismissal she was so accustomed to. It was in the fact that his quiet help never felt like charity, but like a shared burden. He was not saving them. He was standing with them. One evening, as a cold wind swept down from the high peaks, signaling the coming of an early autumn, he arrived with a heavy wool blanket. He simply held it out to her at the door, and May took it, the rough fabric warm against her chilled hands. For the first time, she found the words to breach the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was a question that held everything. Why help us? Why risk the company's wrath? Why care? Thorne looked at her, then past her, his gaze settling on the vast, star-dusted sky above the canyon rim. His face was softened by the twilight, the harsh lines seeming less severe. He was silent for a long time, and she thought he would not answer. "A place is only as good as the decency it's willing to defend," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "There isn't much of it left here. We have to guard what there is." It was not the answer she expected. It was not about her or her mother or their race. It was about him. It was a statement of his own private code, the moral architecture of his solitude. In that moment, and May understood that his protection was not an act of pity. It was an act of self-preservation, a defense of the last remnants of his own humanity in a place that sought to strip it away from everyone. He nodded to her once, a gesture of finality, and turned to leave. "Mayor Thorne," she called out, and he paused, his back still to her. "My name isn't May." He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly, as if her name was a weight he was now choosing to carry. "I know," he said, and then walked away into the growing darkness. She stood in the doorway, clutching the blanket, the simple exchange feeling more significant than any contract or promise. He knew her name. He had seen her not as a desperate Chinese girl, but as a person. In the brutal calculus of Redemption Gulch, this was a revolutionary act. And it was enough to make her believe that survival might, after all, be possible. The fear that had lived in her bones since the attack began to recede, replaced by something new and unfamiliar. A fragile, steely resolve. He was guarding decency. She would have to learn to do the same. The fragile piece was a thin sheet of ice over a raging river, and May could feel the pressure building beneath the surface every time she went into town for supplies. The glares were sharper, the whispers more venomous. Thorne's intervention had not earned them acceptance. It had made them a focal point for the town's resentment. They were no longer just outsiders. They were the mayor's outsiders, a symbol of his defiance against the mining company that was the town's lifeblood and its tyrant. The foreman, Jarrett, and his Pinkertons were a constant, menacing presence. They would stand across the street, watching her, their expressions promising a reckoning. They were waiting for Thorne to look away, just for a moment. The moment came on a blustery afternoon when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and May had gone to the mercantile for flour and salt, pulling her thin shawl tighter against a wind that carried the first chill of winter. Her mother, still healing, had urged her to be quick. The store was empty save for the proprietor, a nervous, weaselly man named Abernathy, who avoided her eyes as he weighed her goods. As she stepped back out onto the boardwalk, her path was blocked. Jarrett stood before her, flanked by Finney and another Pinkerton. The street, usually bustling with miners and mule drivers, was suddenly, unervingly empty. People had seen the confrontation brewing and had vanished into doorways and alleys, their curiosity warring with their fear. "Well now," Jarrett said, his voice a low, oily drawl. He gestured at the small sack in her arms. "Company script for that, I imagine. Or did your protector give you real money?" And May's heart hammered against her ribs, but Thorne's quiet resilience had planted a seed in her. She met Jarrett's gaze and said nothing, her chin held high. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. She tried to step around him. He moved to block her again, a smirk playing on his thick lips. "Your mayor's not here to save you today, girl," he said, his voice dropping. "He's up at the assay office, dealing with a cave-in. A real tragedy." The way he said it implied it was anything but. "That leaves you and your thieving mother all alone. We have unfinished business." Finney reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. And May cried out, dropping the sack of flour, which burst upon the boardwalk, sending up a white cloud that swirled in the wind. The action was a spark to a fuse. From the shadows of the alley beside the mercantile, Thorne emerged. He had not been at the assay office. He had been watching, waiting. His face was a thundercloud. His gray eyes narrowed to slits of cold fury. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man so large and deliberate, closing the distance in 3 long strides. "Take your hand off her," Thorne said. The words were not shouted. They were delivered with a low, lethal intensity that was more terrifying than any yell. Finney, startled, released her arm as if he'd been burned. Jarrett turned, his surprise quickly hardening into anger. "Thorne, you should be minding your own business." "She is my business," Thorne stated, positioning himself squarely between May and the 3 men. He was a wall of resolve. "I told you to leave her alone. I won't tell you again." "Or what?" Jarrett sneered, emboldened by his numbers. "You'll what, Mayor? There's 3 of us. One of you. The company runs this town. Not you." He took a step forward, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. It was a fatal miscalculation. He was challenging not just the man, but the very principle Thorne had articulated to May on her doorstep. He was spitting on the last bit of decency. Thorne didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. His entire being seemed to coil, radiating a palpable menace. "The company buys the rock you pull out of the ground, Jarrett. It doesn't buy the ground itself. This ground is under my authority. And I am telling you, your business here is concluded." His gaze flickered to the faces of the other 2 men. "Walk away now, and all you've lost is your pride. Stay, and you'll lose a good deal more." There was no bluff in his voice. It was a promise of swift, specific, and devastating violence. And May could see the flicker of doubt in Finney's eyes. He was a bully, not a soldier. The 3rd man was already shuffling his feet, looking for an escape. They were paid to intimidate minors and Chinese women. They were not paid to face down a man who looked like he could dismantle them with his bare hands and not lose a night's sleep over it. The confrontation hung in a delicate, violent balance. Jarrett, trapped by his own arrogance, couldn't back down. "You can't protect her forever." "I only have to protect her today," Thorne replied, his voice dropping even lower. "This is your last chance." He took a half-step forward, a subtle, predatory movement. That was all it took. The illusion of the Pinkertons' power shattered against the reality of Thorne's will. Finney took a half-step back, then another. The 3rd man turned and melted back into the alley. Jarrett was left alone, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He stared at Thorne, his mouth working, but no words came out. Finally, with a look of pure hatred directed at May, he turned and stalked away. The street slowly came back to life. Doors creaked open. Faces peered from windows. Thorne stood for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the street, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then he turned to May. He looked at the white dust of the flower on her dark dress and on the splintered wood of the boardwalk. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He bent down, not to retrieve the sack, but to brush a smudge of flour from her sleeve with his calloused fingers. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her breath catch. He then walked into the mercantile, his voice carrying out to her. "Abernathy, give the young lady another sack of flour, and put it on my account." He emerged a moment later, met her eyes one last time, and then walked away, his solitary figure disappearing down the street, leaving May standing in a cloud of white dust, her world irrevocably and profoundly changed. The wind that swept through Redemption Gulch that evening carried a different sort of chill. The threat from Jarrett had not vanished, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the confident swagger of unchecked power, but the sullen, venomous resentment of a bully who had been publicly humiliated. And May felt the shift as she prepared a simple meal of rice and salted vegetables. The fear was still a ghost in the room, but it no longer sat at the head of the table. In its place was a quiet, fierce determination that she had borrowed from Mayor Thorne and was slowly making her own. When a soft knock came at the door, neither she nor her mother flinched. They knew who it was. And May opened the door to find him standing there, a silhouette against a sky bruised with the last vestiges of sunset. He held a small, expertly carved wooden bird in his hand. He offered it to her without a word. It was smooth to the touch, crafted from a piece of pale pine, its tiny form capturing the essence of a sparrow in flight. Peace offering. An apology for the violence she had endured. An acknowledgement of her bravery. It was all of these things and none of them. It was simply a gift. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to it. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate for all he had done. He simply nodded, his gaze moving past her to where her mother, Su Lin, sat by the fire. For the first time, Su Lin spoke directly to him. Her voice was quiet, but clear, her English accented but precise. "You have made a powerful enemy for our sake." "The company was my enemy long before I met you, ma'am," Thorne replied, his voice carrying a weight of history that May could only guess at. "Jarrett is just the current face of it." He looked back at May, his expression unreadable as always, yet she felt a current of understanding pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the alliance that had been forged in crisis and tempered in confrontation. They were partners in this quiet war for decency. He did not stay. He never did. He turned and walked back into the solitude from which he came. And May closed the door and brought the small wooden bird to the firelight. She ran her thumb over its smooth wings. Her initial, desperate plea in his office echoed in her mind. Unalive them. She had begged for an ending, for a vengeance born of helplessness. But Thorne had given her something far more valuable. He had not answered her rage with rage. He had met brutality with an unshakable resolve. He had shown her that true strength was not in the power to destroy, but in the will to endure, to protect, to build. He had not ended her enemies. He had taught her how to stand up to them. The world outside their small shack was still harsh, the future still a vast and uncertain territory. The hatred had not been extinguished, only held at bay. But something fundamental had shifted within May. The fear that had once defined her existence had been replaced by a quiet strength. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, a reed battered by the wind. She was a woman who had faced down violence and found an ally in the most unexpected of men. She was the daughter of a woman whose spirit refused to be broken. She was May. She looked at her mother, who gave her a small, knowing smile. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress, its walls reinforced not by wood and stone, but by their shared resilience and the quiet guardianship of the man who walked the town's dark streets. In the heart of Redemption Gulch, a place that seemed determined to crush the human spirit, two women and a solitary mayor had drawn a line in the dust. They would guard what little decency there was. Together, and May placed the wooden sparrow on the mantelpiece, where it seemed poised to take flight into the uncertain dawn, a small, defiant symbol of hope.